The hindsight. In February, NASA released its investigation into Boeing's Starliner and quietly classified the crewed flight test as a Type A mishap. The hardest category. The story everyone tells is that SpaceX simply out-engineered Boeing. They didn't. NASA's own report says program objectives started influencing engineering decisions. The truth is, Boeing built the spacecraft, but NASA chose, again and again, to keep believing in it. In 2011, the Space Shuttle program ended. For the first time in 30 years, America couldn't fly its own astronauts. So NASA started paying Russia for seats on the Soyuz, roughly $70 million apiece. And how do you fix a problem like that? You build something to replace it. That was the obvious answer. The less obvious answer was how many somethings. NASA's Commercial Crew Program, announced 2010, contracts awarded 2014, was built around an unusual rule. Two independent American crew vehicles from two different companies, so that if either one had a bad year, the other could keep flying. What did NASA call this idea? Dissimilar redundancy. The people who lived through the Soyuz years called it something simpler. They called it never again. Here's the thing almost nobody focuses on. The two-provider rule wasn't a preference. It was the foundation of the program. Everything downstream, the awards, the schedules, the certifications, was built on top of it. Which means, from day one, NASA wasn't just buying spacecraft. It was protecting an architecture. In September 2014, NASA hands out the contracts. Boeing, $4.2 billion. SpaceX, $2.6 billion. Why was Boeing's award so much bigger? Because Boeing was the incumbent. Boeing had built Apollo capsules, space shuttle main structures, half of the International Space Station. SpaceX had been launching cargo for 2 years. The math the Source Selection Board did was the math any reasonable board would do. Pay more to the company you trust more. Both contracts were firm, fixed price, meaning the company designs it, builds it, certifies it, and absorbs any overruns. NASA's risk is capped. That was the New Deal. Then comes 2016, and here's the part that was buried in the footnotes. NASA quietly modifies Boeing's contract. They pay an additional $287 million above the fixed price for the option to order future missions. Boeing said yes. NASA said yes. 2 years later, the NASA Office of Inspector General reviewed the deal. It flagged $187 million as unnecessary. And what about SpaceX? The OIG noted SpaceX was never given the same opportunity. So, what does that tell you? It tells you that 2 years into the program, the agency was already paying extra to keep one specific provider in the game, not because the architecture demanded it. Because the architecture required a second one to exist, and Boeing was the second one they had. December 2019, Starliner's first uncrewed test flight, OFT-1. Within hours of launch, a mission clock error puts the spacecraft in the wrong orbit. It never reaches the space station. NASA and Boeing produce a joint review. And how many corrective actions did they find? 80. Not one, not a dozen. 80 separate things that had to change before another flight. 2.5 years later, May 2022, OFT-2 finally docks with the ISS and returns clean. The program calls it a recovery beat. But was the underlying program actually fixed? That's the question almost nobody asked out loud. Boeing's 10K, NASA's internal reviews, and the 2026 mishap report all later admitted propulsion qualification gaps remained. June 2024, Starliner launches its first human crew, Butch Wilmore, Suni Williams, on what's planned as an 8-day test. Within hours of approach to the ISS, thrusters in the surface module start underperforming. Helium leaks appear in the propulsion lines. By August, NASA has decided it can't accept the risk of bringing the crew home in this vehicle. So why did NASA certify forward at every prior step? This is the question the whole video turns on. The answer isn't that the agency missed the signals, it's that the two-provider architecture had stopped being the goal. It had started being a lens. Every anomaly got read against the question, can we keep moving, instead of should we? And to be clear, that's the kind of mistake reasonable people make, which is what makes it the dangerous one. And then the bill came due. August 2024, NASA makes the call. Starliner returns uncrewed. The astronauts stay on the ISS and come home, eventually, on a SpaceX Dragon. What was the original mission length? 8 days. The actual stay? More than 9 months. March 18, 2025. Wilmore and Williams splash down off Florida in a SpaceX capsule. Then the structural retreats begin. November 2025. NASA and Boeing quietly modify the contract. Starliner 1, originally a crew rotation, becomes uncrewed cargo. The order remains, but 2 missions are now optional. NASA, in writing, has stopped assuming Starliner will fly crew on a regular cadence. Boeing's 2025 annual report logs another $523 million in commercial crew losses. The program has been a financial wound on every quarterly call for nearly a decade. So why didn't Boeing walk away? Because walking away meant conceding the program back to a single provider. The architecture NASA built around 2 crew vehicles became the thing keeping Boeing in the game, even as the losses kept climbing. And then, the report. February 19, 2026, NASA classifies the crewed flight test as a Type A mishap, the highest severity it uses. What NASA wrote next is in the public record. Almost nobody outside aerospace has read it. It didn't blame thrusters, it didn't blame software. It named in order hardware failures, qualification gaps, leadership missteps, and cultural breakdowns. That last word is the one that mattered. For the first time, NASA put on paper what it had been telling itself privately for years. This wasn't just a Boeing failure. It was a shared one. Look back at the whole arc, the bigger contract, the 2016 extra payment, the 80 recommendations after OFT1, the unresolved propulsion gaps before CFT. None of these were missed. Every one of them was seen, and then weighed against the question of whether the program could keep moving toward 2 providers. Why? Because once an organization decides what it needs to be true, evidence stops arriving as evidence. It arrives as something to be managed. And this is what NASA, in February of this year, finally wrote down. The Type A mishap report's most important line wasn't about hardware. It was the admission that program objectives, the agency's own goals, had started influencing engineering decisions. This is how careful organizations end up making the calls only careless ones are supposed to make. Not by ignoring risk, by needing a particular outcome so badly that risk starts sounding like an obstacle to the version of themselves they've already committed to being. Which is the part of this story that should bother all of us.